You've seen this weapon more times than you can count. On tanks rolling through deserts, on Humvees crawling down dusty roads, on helicopters, bombers, and just about every American war movie ever made. The .50 caliber machine gun is so familiar that most people barely notice it anymore. It's just there, always there, like it has always been. And in a way it has. This gun has been around for more than 100 years. Empires rose, empires fell. Uniforms changed, wars changed. But this weapon stayed almost exactly the same. Same sound, same silhouette, same brutal purpose. But here's the strange part. For something so famous, so iconic, we almost never talk about the person standing behind it. Because the .50 doesn't fire itself. Someone has to stand there. Someone has to climb up. Someone has to step out of cover, grab those handles, and become the most visible target on the battlefield. While everyone else stays inside armor behind walls or beneath steel, that person is up high, exposed, outlined against the sky like a warning sign. It's almost ironic. The most powerful machine gun on the vehicle is usually operated by the least protected human being on it. Movies don't linger on that. Video games don't show it. History books mention the weapon, not the man gripping it, while bullets are looking for his head. And nobody puts a camera on what it feels like to stand there knowing that every enemy nearby knows exactly where you are. Across generations, across wars, that position stayed the same. Different battlefields, same outcome. The gun survives. The gun gets upgraded. The gun keeps going. The people behind it don't. So the real question isn't how powerful the .50 caliber is. The real question is much simpler and much darker. Why is the person behind the most dangerous weapon so often the easiest one to kill? The story of the .50 caliber doesn't begin with dominance. It begins with frustration. World War I showed the world something new and deeply inconvenient. Airplanes were no longer fragile. They were faster, tougher, and sometimes armored just enough to laugh at rifle fire. American troops watched .30 caliber rounds hit enemy aircraft and do almost nothing. It was like throwing pebbles at a moving truck and hoping for a miracle. So the request was simple, not elegant, not poetic, just brutally practical. We need something that hits harder, something that punches through instead of bouncing off, something that doesn't ask for permission. That demand created the .50 BMG, a cartridge so powerful for its time that it felt almost excessive. It wasn't just bigger, it was in a completely different category. More speed, more mass, more energy. It was designed with one idea in mind: if it gets hit, it should stop being a problem. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a nightmare to carry, mount, and control. The early versions were massive, heavy enough to make crews question their life choices. Water-cooled, awkward, and prone to overheating if pushed too hard. And if it wasn't overheating, it was breaking something else. Barrels cracked, mounts failed, mobility disappeared. But here's the thing. Even when it didn't work well, nobody wanted to give it up, because when it did work, nothing else could replace it. And slowly, as engineers fixed one problem after another, something else became clear. This weapon demanded a price, not in steel or fuel, but in exposure. To use its full power, someone had to be where the gun could see everything. High, open, unhidden. You couldn't fire it from a trench and expect miracles. You couldn't hide behind armor and still give it the angles it needed. The gun didn't move itself into danger. The person operating it did. That trade-off was baked in from the beginning. More reach meant less cover. More dominance meant more risk. The 50 caliber solved a battlefield problem brilliantly. It just quietly handed the danger to the human holding the grips. And once that bargain was made, history never really changed it. By the time World War II erupted, the 50 caliber finally found the war it had been waiting for. American strategy believed in altitude formation and overwhelming defensive fire. Bombers would fly high, stay together, and turn the sky itself into a killing zone. On paper, it sounded logical. In reality, it turned the air into an industrial furnace of metal and flesh. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator weren't named for poetry. They carried guns everywhere, nose, waist, tail, belly. 13 50 caliber machine guns on some variants spread across multiple positions. Out of a crew of 10, most were gunners. Their job wasn't just to defend the aircraft. It was to absorb attention, fire, and fear while the bombs went on their way. The aircraft version of the M2 was lighter and faster. Its rate of fire nearly doubled. Because when a fighter crosses your field of view at several hundred miles per hour, you don't get time to think. You get seconds, sometimes less. So you flood the air with bullets and hope the math favors you. There was no armor around these men, no real protection. Waist gunners stood in open windows, wind screaming past them at minus 40 degrees. The ball turret gunner curled into a glass sphere beneath the aircraft, separated from everyone else with no parachute on his back. The tail gunner sat alone far behind the crew, watching the sky that wanted him dead. And the enemy understood this very quickly. German pilots learned that to kill the bomber, you didn't start with the engines. You started with the men holding the guns. Gunners became priority targets. Not because they were weak, but because they were exposed. So while the bomber was called a flying fortress, the gunners were its bare skin. Every hit they took was felt immediately. Casualty rates among gunners were the highest on the aircraft. Some didn't die from bullets at all, but from cold so severe that fingers froze to metal if gloves came off for even a moment. It's a strange contradiction. The aircraft was designed to survive combat through firepower. But that firepower depended on young men standing in open air at 25,000 feet, trying not to bleed, freeze, or fall. The 50 caliber dominated the sky. The men behind it paid the price. And the sky learned to hunt them. If there is one place that defines fear for a 50 caliber gunner in World War II, it hangs beneath the aircraft like a bad idea that nobody wanted to admit was insane. The ball turret. A clear sphere barely wide enough for a human body suspended under the belly of a bomber rotating slowly through empty sky. To fit inside, you didn't climb in. You folded yourself. Knees bent back, curved chin tucked down. There was no room to turn around, no room to stretch, and certainly no room for a parachute. Not because someone forgot it, but because there was simply nowhere to put it. Once the hatch closed, the world became glass, metal, and cold. Absolute cold. Minus 40 degrees, sometimes worse. Your breath froze. Your fingers numbed. And the guns were right there, inches from your face, reminding you why you were here. The worst part wasn't being shot at. It was knowing what happened if something went wrong. If the electrical motor failed, you had a hand crank. If the crank failed, you were stuck. And if the aircraft had to land with you still down there was no heroic ending. The turret would hit the ground first. You would be crushed between aluminum and concrete. Pilots knew this. Everyone knew this. Some aircraft commanders landed anyway, fully aware that their ball turret gunner wouldn't survive the touchdown. It's the kind of decision no one trains for and no one forgets. One former gunner later said that by the time they reached the target, he was so cold, so exhausted, that he stopped caring whether he lived or died. That wasn't bravery. That was numbness. Statistics show that many gunners didn't die from bullets at all. Cold injuries claimed fingers, toes, sometimes entire hands. If gloves came off to clear a jam, bare skin froze to metal almost instantly. The gun didn't forgive mistakes. The sky didn't either. The ball turret was harder to hit than other positions. Smaller target, awkward angle. That was the irony. It wasn't the enemy that terrified the men inside. It was the exit. When the .50 caliber came down from the sky and touched the ground, the rules didn't get safer. They just got closer. Buildings, tree lines, stone walls, things that used to mean protection suddenly stopped working. The M2 didn't knock. It didn't negotiate. It went straight through. Infantry learned this quickly. A wall that shrugged off rifle fire would crumble under sustained .50 caliber bursts. Windows became death traps. Trenches stopped feeling deep enough. Even light and medium armored vehicles weren't safe. Optics shattered. Tracks snapped. Thin side armor failed. If you were behind something solid, the M2 turned it into debris. Naturally, the enemy adapted. Not by charging into that fire, but by thinking. Snipers, artillery, mortars. Anything that could remove the gun without fighting it head-on. Because trying to outshoot a .50 was a short way to disappear from the battlefield. That logic made the gunner the priority target. Always visible. Always louder than everything else. Always announcing his position with every burst. You didn't need binoculars to find him. The gun did the advertising for you. Then there was the quad mount. 4 50s linked together, spitting out a storm of metal that felt less like shooting and more like erasing. Designed to shred low-flying aircraft, it quickly found a second career against ground targets. Trees vanished. Cover evaporated. Enemy soldiers didn't get pinned. They got removed from the equation. The gunners knew exactly what that meant. The louder the weapon, the shorter your life expectancy. Dark humor traveled fast among crews. If they're shooting at you, at least you're doing your job. It was funny in the way only desperate people laugh. Sometimes, the battlefield collapsed into a single moment. One man, one gun. No backup, no armor. Standing in the open, because moving meant losing the position. There are recorded cases where a lone .50 caliber gunner held off attacking forces long enough for others to escape. Not because it was smart, because there was nothing else left to do. Firepower buys time. Sometimes it buys survival for everyone else, and sometimes it buys a medal with no one left to wear it. On the ground, the .50 caliber didn't just dominate the fight, it rewrote it. But every rewrite had a footnote written in blood, and it always pointed to the same place, the person holding the grips. By the time the Korean War began, it was already clear this wasn't a one-time mistake. The same weapon, the same position, the same outcome. Only now the scale was larger, and the pressure never stopped. When Chinese forces launched massed human wave attacks, they didn't trickle forward. They surged. Thousands of soldiers moving at once across open ground straight toward defensive lines. This was where the quad mount earned its reputation. 4 50 calibers firing together, hammering non-stop cutting lanes through advancing infantry. Veterans described it as mowing wheat, brutal, effective, and relentless. But effectiveness had a cost. The firing never stopped long enough for barrels to cool. Metal glowed red, barrels sagged. Crews poured water over the guns just to keep them alive a little longer. The enemy kept coming, and the gunners stayed exposed wave after wave, knowing that if the weapon failed, the line failed. Then came Vietnam, and the nightmare didn't fade. It just changed shape. On the rivers of the Mekong Delta, patrol boats pushed through narrow waterways where ambushes happened at distances so close you could see faces. The PBR gunners stood behind twin 50s in fiberglass boats that offered more speed than protection. Every bend in the river was a question mark. Every burst of fire announced exactly where the gunners stood. Casualty rates told the story. During the worst periods, roughly 6% of PBR crews were killed or wounded every single month. Over a full tour, that meant most crews could expect to be hit at least once. The 50 kept them alive long enough to fight back. It also made sure the enemy never lost track of them. On land convoy, ambushes forced soldiers to improvise. Gun trucks appeared welded together by necessity rather than doctrine. Armor scavenged. Weapons mounted wherever they fit. Old quad mounts dragged out of storage and bolted onto truck beds. None of it was officially approved. All of it was absolutely necessary. The message was clear. If no one protects us, we'll protect ourselves. Vietnam also proved something else. The 50 wasn't just brute force. With optics mounted, it became precision. Long-range hits at distances rifles couldn't reach. Incredible capability, paired with the same old vulnerability. The gun could reach far. The man behind it was still standing in the open. Month after month, the pattern repeated. The M2 saved lives, and it attracted fire. It held lines, and it marked targets. It was both shield and magnet. By Korea and Vietnam, there was no excuse left. The lesson had been taught repeatedly. The problem wasn't new. It was familiar. And yet the solution still hadn't arrived. By the time American forces entered Iraq and Afghanistan, you would expect the lesson to have been learned. Satellites in orbit, drones in the sky, precision weapons everywhere. And yet, on dusty roads and narrow streets, the most exposed person in the convoy was still standing upright, half his body outside the vehicle, gripping a .50 caliber like it was 1944. The Humvee wasn't designed for this war. Early models had thin aluminum bodies that couldn't stop rifle fire, let alone explosives. And the gunner stood above it all, unshielded, framed perfectly against the skyline. From the enemy's point of view, it was almost considerate. No guessing required. The target was already standing up. Insurgents adapted fast. They didn't challenge the vehicle. They challenged the man. Snipers waited for the moment the gunner scanned left or right. RPGs were aimed at the turret ring. Grenades were tossed from rooftops straight into open hatches. IEDs turned the thin armor into a spray of fragments that always reached the highest point first. Everyone knew it. The gunner knew it best. Standing there meant accepting that you were the first to be seen, the first to be shot at, and often the first to die. Dark humor followed, as it always does. At least I've got a good view, some joked. A strange thing to say when that view might be the last one you ever see. There were moments that forced the question no one wanted to ask. Soldiers who climbed onto burning vehicles to keep firing. Men who stayed on the gun until the last second so others could escape. Acts of courage that were real, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable. Because bravery shouldn't be a substitute for protection. By the early 2000s, this wasn't an ignorance anymore. It wasn't a lack of technology. It was inertia. The same role, the same risk passed down to another generation and given a new uniform. This is where the story becomes difficult to defend. When you have the technology to protect your soldiers but still ask them to stand exposed, something is wrong. Not tactically, ethically. The .50 caliber was still doing its job perfectly. The problem wasn't the weapon. It was the decision to keep placing human beings in front of it century after century, hoping courage would cover the gap where armor should have been. And that question hung in the air heavier than any round fired. Why was this still acceptable? It took nearly 100 years for the obvious solution to arrive. Not a new bullet, not a stronger barrel, not another brave man standing higher than everyone else. The solution was simple, almost embarrassingly so. Remove the human from the most dangerous position. Remote weapon stations changed everything quietly. The guns stayed on the roof. The soldier moved inside. The same .50 caliber, the same power, the same reach, but now controlled with a joystick and a screen, instead of exposed hands and a visible silhouette. No wind tearing at your face, no skyline framing your body, no invitation for every enemy eye. For the first time in its long service life, the M2 could fight without asking someone to volunteer as bait. What's striking is how little the weapon itself changed. The basic design John Browning finalized over a century ago still works. The gun adapted to vehicles, aircraft, jungles, deserts, and cities without complaint. It outlived war's doctrines and generations of soldiers. Serial numbers aged better than the men who fired them. Humans, on the other hand, changed a lot. We learned, slowly, painfully, one conflict at a time. We learned that courage is not armor, that heroism should not be part of the job description, that survival should not depend on standing taller than everyone else and hoping the enemy misses. There's a quiet irony in all of this. The solution didn't make the battlefield kinder. It just made it more honest. The weapon was never the problem. It did exactly what it was built to do. The problem was where we placed the person. After a century of exposed gunners, frostbite shrapnel, and last stands, the answer finally arrived, not as a triumph, but as an admission. We could have done this earlier, we just didn't. And that leaves one final thought hanging in the air, heavier than any machine gun ever built. The problem was never the gun. It was where we chose to put the human being behind it.